So before we get started, just a couple paper notes. So here you can see, get over here, sketchbook. So here you can see I've got kind of a paper sampler. Some companies will send these to you if you request them. Sometimes you just pay a couple bucks. It's definitely helpful if maybe you aren't able to get to the store and kind of actually feel the differences between the papers, because it's very helpful. Because as you guys are getting to know these different things, a lot of beginners assume that, oh, well, I'll just do what my teacher says, or I'll just pick out whatever happens to be around. Your paper choice is going to matter more and more as we get into this alternative media type of stuff, especially as you're working with wet materials, dry materials. Paying attention to the texture of the paper and the thickness, it's pretty important. Even though, when you post your pictures, we're not able to pick up the sheet of paper and see how thick it is, it still matters to you, and it still matters, when it comes to how the material sits on the page. So here we've got by Legion Paper, some essential drawing papers, not sponsored, but these are some really common papers that are sold in nearly every art supply store, online and in person. So, if you do get these kind of paper samplers, usually it'll say what they are. You'll notice that some of them, like we said, some paper has a bit of a tooth to it. Let me see if I can find one that's a bit toothy to it. Let's go over to some of these watercolor papers. So let's see. So you'll notice, if you do a lot of wet materials, there's paper called Yupo paper that's very, very smooth, right? You guys probably can't see that. I'm kind of sort of shiny here. Um, there's paper that's translucent too. But then, of course, there's also paper that's kind of rougher, right? I'm not sure if you guys can quite see that. But this rougher paper catches the ink and catches the pen in different ways, right? You guys can imagine, if you have a really tiny pen line, you'll be going into the little crevices of the paper, and sometimes that texture can be really helpful too. So just kind of keep an eye on different types of paper. If you're good with what you got, that's great. But if you're looking to expand your horizons, we do keep these samplers in the studio. Most suppliers will upload pictures, close-up pictures of the textures of what the paper is supposed to be. So if you're ever not sure what's supposed to be happening, that's totally fine. You can probably, there's a lot of good pictures and resources online. Most students, let's see, if you're looking for kind of a nicer paper that can take moisture a bit easier, um, in terms of economy, we've got things like Stonehenge is usually kind of a good economical type of paper. Printmakers use it a lot. Here we have, it also comes in black as well as craft too, the brown. So that's kind of a good economical type of printmaking, wet material paper. If you're feeling fancy, there's Revere paper. There's also Arches, Reeves BFK. There's a lot of different types of paper. So, if you're going to be taking printmaking or other classes like that, these choices will be even more important. But for drawing, like we said, we just want to keep in mind, is the paper have texture? Can it handle moisture or not? Side right now. A bit of practice on a page in my sketchbook, because it feels good to include practice in your sketchbook, kind of your repository, because you can always go back and say, oh, well, here's where I did this, here's where I did that, here's my value scales, what does it look like here? So that's what I suggest doing. But of course, if you feel more comfortable practicing on full sheets, power to you, you do you. So to practice, of course, you can do some free form practice, getting to know your supplies, right? So, if you're over in the corner, you want to do it in the middle. Um, like we said, I know all of you guys have ballpoint pens around. So it's always good to have one of these around if you wanted to experiment a little bit, because ballpoint pens can kind of act a little bit more kind of like your pencils in terms of the fact the pressure really matters. Most people, when they're writing with a ballpoint pen, they're just making lines, right? Something like that. Let me zoom in so you guys can see what's popping. We are very close. Hopefully my arm doesn't fly around. Usually when you're drawing with a ballpoint pen, you're just making lines. Easy peasy. But if you've ever tried to draw with a ballpoint pen in terms of doing value, sometimes it's good to kind of, you can almost shade with a ballpoint pen. If you press lightly, you can kind of get tones with it, right? So some people like to experiment with that. So that's why you sometimes see, you know, I know it's pretty spicy on social media to do these kind of photorealistic drawings with ballpoint pens and all that good stuff. So, it might be something to try, because it might be a little bit different than what you're used to using the supplies for. So ballpoint pen, a good extra to experiment with. When it comes to the stuff in this class, we've got our microns and we've got our Pitt pens. So here are some of the Faber-Castell Pitt pens. They look like this. They are black. There's black ink. Good times there. The caps will have letters on them, right? You guys can see there's an S and a B. If you lose the caps or you mismatch them, you can always check on the pen. It says the letter of what type of pen it is, right? So the Faber-Castells, it's a set of 4. You get this brush pen, which is kind of cool. You guys can see the tip of that. It's nice and soft. When you apply it in different terms of pressure, you can get these really kind of lovely sort of brush stroke type of lines, right? Then, of course, we also have the other 3 Pitt pens, which, are small, fine, and then something else. I'd always forget what that other one is. This is the small one. So you can see we do have our little nib here, right? You guys can see we've got metal, and then we've got the tip of the pen. So keep in mind that tip of the pen is where all the ink is soaking into. So you can see when you press, you get a nice crisp line, right? And it's sharp no matter what angle you're at, which is pretty cool because I know some of you guys like to tilt when you draw a little bit more. So this pen will stay nice and crisp. With these pens, these and then the microns that have the little kind of nib to it, you want to be very careful because if you press really hard, that nib can break, right? And then your pen is dead and sad. So we definitely don't want that. So that's not to say that you can't push decently hard, but you don't want to be crushing it, right? So if you know that you're a very heavy-handed person, especially the sizes of pens, microns definitely have a lot more variety, right? Here you can see, like we said, the microns will have, just like the Pitts, the size here, as well as on, that's not focusing, but you guys, there we go. So you guys can see it's also listed on the cap, but sometimes the caps get, if you're wild, they can definitely get switched around. So always check the pen. Like we said, the Faber-Castell and the microns are great because they're archival, meaning that in 50 years, this ink won't be fading. It'll still be nice and black, crisp. It's not going to discolor. If you leave your drawings out in the sun or in under your bed or in the attic, they're still going to stay black, right? Which is pretty cool. We like that. So what's great about our old friend microns, so they do make this, Pigma makes a brush tip. So theirs is a little bit spikier, a little bit sharper than the Pitt pen. So if you like brush pens, pay attention to your points of comparison. This one you can get a little bit of a sharper line, right? As you can see here. So definitely compare and contrast. Think about what you like. Some students don't really like the brush tips because they can be a little bit finicky, right? And it's very easy to outline too hard because it is such a large tip. So just kind of take it easy with those if you know that you're the type of person to draw a little too dark all over the place. Then, of course, we have our microns. Everybody kind of has their favorite micron size. It definitely depends on what you're working on. You can see that our 03 is a pretty comparable to the S for the Pitt pens, which is fine. So here you can see, again, we have a nice nib with a nice black line, right? Pretty self-explanatory. You can see that as the numbers get smaller, so that's a 03, if we open the 01, you will see that that line is thinner, right? You guys know how numbers work. You know how math works. The smaller the number, the smaller the pen nib size is going to be. If you want to go, like we said, ultra thin, Micron does have the 005s, which are great for super fine detail. If you've ever wondered about how to get super tiny details, 005 is going to hook you up. So you can barely see the tip here. It's really small. It's really tiny. So you can see those lines are even finer than our others, our 01s, our 03s. So definitely use the pen that suits your needs the best. Obviously, if you wanted to make a thick line with the 05, you could go over it. You could kind of shade it and color it and widen it up. But why do that when you can just use, something like the 03, right? You already have a nice robust line. So work smarter, not harder, but I know people that use the same pen for their whole drawing and it's totally fine, right? Also, I did want to alert you to Micron does make, if maybe you're having trouble adjusting to those kind of nibs, Micron does make a one that has PN. You can see it's blue as opposed to purple. And this one is kind of a more traditional plastic tip pen. You guys can see that here, right? Good times. Let me try to get it to focus. Yeah, there we go. And this one can act a little bit more sturdy, right? You can press a little bit harder. It can kind of stand up to a little bit more roughness. So if you know that you like kind of a plastic tip pen, but you still want that archival quality, the Micron PN is kind of a good one to, it's kind of a good bridge, kind of a good gateway, right? And depending on the type of set that you get, like we said, sometimes there's Micron sets that have all the numbers and all of the types. Sometimes there's the Micron, I know there's like, you know, a sketch, a group for, I think they give you like 6 pens that are good for, you know, comics and manga and that kind of stuff, where it's like, oh, these are good for lining. You know, definitely look at the types of sizes that are included and choose the ones that are best for you. Anyway, let's get rid of those for a second. So let's do a little bit of practice, right? So to start off, if you'd like to do form doodling like I did down, we're going to do a little bit more of a structured practice up here, and we're going to do a value scale because it's good to kind of bridge the gap between what we learned last module and which we're going to be doing this module. So you can see I'm just going to take a corner of my paper. I wrote value scale here so I remember. We're going to practice layering some lines. So we can go ahead and pick out any pen. I recommend picking something kind of medium. Don't pick super fine or super thick. I'm going to stick with, let's see here, maybe 01. Yeah, I'm going to use a 01 Micron. You can use whatever you'd like. If you'd like to use the S Faber-Castell, totally fine. Kind of just a middle baseline sort of situation, right? So what I'm going to do to start my value scale is I'm going to draw a rectangle. You can use a ruler if you'd like, but I already sat down, so I'm not getting up. So you draw a little scale, and then we're going to divide this up into maybe 6 or 7 boxes and into it. Let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So just like our warm up with our value exercises, we're going to practice layering lines so that we can experiment with different values, right? So let me zoom in even more so you guys can see bigger on the screen because I know the quality isn't always not always ideal. And let me make sure not to cast a shadow for you guys. So as we mentioned, hatching and cross hatching are 2 great fundamentals, right? Just to kind of give you a quick refresher, hatching is when all the lines go in the same direction. Cross hatching is where the lines go in more than one direction, for example, like you see here. Cross hatching can go in many, many directions, which we'll be practicing up at our value scale. All right, you can see that the more patches of line that you apply going in different directions, the darker it's going to get. We also have scumbling, like we said, and then stippling. So those are going to be your big 4. Know them, love them. Whether you use them all is up to you and the objects that you draw. So let's do a value scale with just some hatching and cross hatching. Some students like to practice doing value scales for all of these line techniques. That's up to you. So first, we're going to have white of the page, right? We're not going to do anything to that because that's going to be our lightest value. This next one will be light. So let's add some lines, right? So you can see when you space lines further out, you make them thinner, that area is going to appear as a lighter tone, right? Then next, if we want to get darker, what we can do is apply the same level of lines, right? And then, let's see here. What you can do, you can either add some more lines, right? So added lines. If you squint, that area appears slightly darker than this one. It's a darker value. So next here, you can kind of see what we're doing. We're going to add the same level of lines. And we're going to say, okay, well, how do I make this one look darker than this one? Well, I could add more lines interspersed there. Just let me not kick my camera. There we go. All right. You could add more lines interspersed there. All right. To get even darker values. All right. The more lines we get, darker it looks. And we can keep going. All right. Again, layering more lines on top of each other, closer together. That's going to give you those darker areas. Right. So if you're doing a pen drawing and you're like, oh, How do I do my shadows? You can keep adding lines on top of lines, closer together, all that good stuff. So let me just finish off this value scale here, and I can show you how to take this layering even further. Okay. So like we said, we want to examine the layering. We want to examine and thickness, right? Darkest, right? So you can see I'm drawing kind of fast. It's just for demonstration purposes. Definitely keep an eye on speed because pens don't care if you're a good person or not. They care about what you're doing on the page, right? So again, here you can see light to dark using hatching, lines going in a single direction. If you want to take it a step further, cross hatching is a great way to add even more layering. So you can see that I'm making the lines go in a different direction, right? And that makes it look even darker. You can also cross hatch with less frequency, right? To still get kind of those different intermediary tones. So like we said, I turned this hatching value scale into a cross hatching one. So that's kind of fun times. Right. So I recommend start with the value scale so that you know your materials and you know what you're responsible for. Because remember, 6 divisions of light and shadow, we still got them, we still see them, you still got to put them on there. So I suggest if you don't know what to do a value scale to start off with. It's a great way to warm up. And of course, you know, if we're looking at your drawings that you turn in and we say, okay, well, these look a little flat, they don't look like they have enough contrast or enough layering, I'll say, hey, did you ever do a value scale? What did that look like? You should definitely do that. So when it comes to bridging theory with actual practice, I like to start off with simple shapes to do a little bit of extra practice. So you'll notice on that worksheet that was on the slides, I practiced with just a sphere because it's just a nice, easy shape. We don't have to worry about sighting or anything like that, but it gives us a chance to practice with our value. So after I did my value scale, I'm going to go over here. If you did want to draw with a little graphite first, if that helps you, that's great. So I'm going to show you guys what that looks like here. So I'm basically going to draw kind of a sphere. Doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to draw a ground just so that my area is grounded in reality, right? So just a simple shape. If you want to practice with a cube or a triangle, a cylinder, whatever, it's good to start with a simple shape because when we start to apply, we can think fundamental. One is up here, shining down, right? So that means we're going to have, you know, a cast shadow probably over here. And since this is a purely invented space, we can use what we learned about light and shadow to kind of adapt to that. So with our practice, we need to take a look at some things that we can do with the pen to make things look more natural, right? So first and foremost, we need to look, we need to use our observational skills. We need to avoid checking out and kind of going through the motions, all that good stuff. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to line my pencil sketch with my pen. So I'm just going to go in and outline. I'm still using my 01 micron. All right. So I'm just outlining what I did in pencil, just inking it up. All right. And then give this a couple seconds to dry, kind of take a look and see, okay, is that dry? If it is dry, you can come back with your eraser, and since the pen is permanent, you can erase those sketchy lines that you made. Looks like it didn't happen, right? Good times. So this is helpful, you know, if you're drawing, when you're drawing your objects, your still lives, or things like that, because you can still do your sketching and your citing. You can just erase it later, right? All right, so now we have our little practice shape. So we know that we have light coming over here, right? So our highlights are probably going to be chilling over here, our areas of general light, shadow, core of shadow, reflected light, cast shadow. We know where all that stuff is kind of going to play out, right? So a lot of students, it's kind of hard to say, okay, well, how do we start, right? So it's always a good idea to remember back to our friend cross contour. And so when we start to apply our lines, having them follow the curve of the surface of the object is a great way to retain that dimension, because a lot of times with pen drawing, things can look way too flat, right? Because we know that, you know, that can definitely be a valid aesthetic, right? We appreciate, you know, comics and graphic art and stuff like that, because there is such a strong contrast and such a nice balance of flat and dimension. But in this drawing, we kind of want this to look still natural, right? So I like to start in the darker parts of my area because, as I mentioned, I like to draw too dark. So I know that for me, might as well get those dark areas nailed out. So if you want to start with your pencil and say, okay, well, my highlight's going to be here, my area of light, my shadow starts here. I got a core of shadow and my cast shadow over here. If that helps you, if you want to do your patches with your pencil first, that's definitely can be a good way to feel less nervous. For pen is permanent. Good. Pressing light on the page, barely grazing the surface. Right? So you can see it, I'm letting my lines travel with my object, right? And you can see I'm kind of doing these kind of shorter, kind of medium length lines. That's good to start off with. Some people like to start off with longer lines. I'm going to be layering in some cross hatching to kind of help blend this out. So that's what's going to be helpful to me. So I know that this bottom area is going to have some darkness. I'm rotating so I can use my wrist, the fine motions of my wrist. And again, just like when we did value, your drawing might look a little busted, a little sad for the middle portions, but things will come together as we continue to layer, right? As we continue to persevere. A lot of times when we see pen drawings that aren't necessarily as successful, or ones that don't really get, you know, the best grades, it's usually because people stopped too early, they gave up, bad times, right? Rotate your page if you'd like. I like to do that so that I make sure that I'm able to take advantage of my fine wrist movement, right? And I'm keeping rotating just to kind of get the roundness of this guy figured out, right? And like we said, experiment, right? If you're barely grazing the paper, you can get some really beautiful, whoops, there we go. You can get really beautiful fine lines. If you press a little harder, you get more distinct, sharper, crisper lines. So think about wispy versus crisp and allow that your line pressure to affect that, right? So I might want to get a little more wispier, a little lighter with my touch as I get up to my areas of light and highlight, right? Because as we learned from our value scale, the less frequent the lines, the lighter they are, that area appears lighter, right? Which is what we want. And we want to be extra careful that we don't overly darken this area. You can always add more. It's a lot harder to take away pen, as you guys all know, right? So less is more, and you can always add more later, right? I'm still going to add, some lines around here because this is some areas of general light. Again, rotate the page as needed. That's really helpful because sometimes trying to get your wrist to do things that it's not really naturally attuned to can make your lines look a little sad. So we definitely don't want that from you guys. So like we said, you can do little dashes, you can do different dots, patterns, and things like that. But it's important to get your first kind of pass through done. So now you can step back and say, okay, this is lacking a lot of contrast, right? Even though there are technically pen lines, there's technically contrast, we can go deeper, right? And of course, lack of contrast is one of the dangers, things we should avoid, right? So now that we have our initial pass through, remember your value scale. The more you layer, the darker you can get. So to show you what I mean by that, we can do our areas of deeper shadow and our core of shadow. We want to keep this little area over here a little bit lighter because that's probably where our reflected light is. So I'm just going to go ahead and add some more lines here. If you want to change the type of pen that you're using, if you're noticing that maybe your lines are coming out too dark or too heavy, switch to a lighter pen. Or you can, make it so that you're not pressing as hard, right? Relax, stretch your hand out, that kind of stuff. All right, so you can see I'm making lines go in different directions. They're still kind of curving with my object. One thing you want to avoid is flattening out your object. I'll show you a little bonus guy over here. You want to avoid, let's say we got our little guy over here. These are going to be our our bad spheres down here. So you want to avoid making lines that are perfectly straight either way on your object because that will tend to flatten out your object. So if I were to say, okay, time to shade in my object, if I make just a bunch of verticals and horizontals, I can see it's going to be a lot harder for me to make this look like it's a rounded object because those flat lines are going to flatten it out. Even if I were to, get a little fancy with it, you can still get some impressions of light and shadow, but it's less naturalistic. So it's always a good idea to curve your line. Remember your old friend contour. Another thing you want to avoid is overly darkening your outlines, right? We have our outer contour. Sometimes people kind of make really dark lines for the outline. What this does, it's going to make your drawing look very graphic and very flat, right? Those are great aesthetics other places, but here, maybe not so much. So let's keep going on our little friend, the sphere. So I recommend if you're going to be doing these little warm-up activities, maybe set a timer for, half hour so that you don't spend all of your time this week making your spheres because you still got to turn in a drawing, right? Got to make something. So like we said, kind of take a look at your edge quality, how you're layering, that kind of stuff. It's always good to do a little practice while the stakes are not as high, right? Because if you're just diving into your still life or your collection of objects, that can sometimes be not always be the best or most effective place to experiment, right? Sometimes students will limit themselves and they won't really try different things because they don't want to, quote, mess up their drawing. If you're warming up, if you're practicing, you can make all your mistakes here. Not all of them, you'll probably still make mistakes from time to time. But if you make a lot of those significant mistakes and experimental things here, then you can go to your drawing with the knowledge and with, the skills to really make some of these big moves happen. So you can see I'm layering quite a bit. That's what's kind of fun about pen is that, you can layer in all kinds of different directions to really build up your texture, to build up, what's going on in terms of the shadow of this object. Like we said, don't be afraid to make big moves. It's always a good idea to step away from your work and come back and say, okay, if I squint at this thing, do I start to see values or is it all just kind of a big gray blob on my page? Hopefully that's not the case. Because like we said, some students struggle. They'll either start too dark or they'll be too afraid to get dark. So, take a look at your own work if you notice that you're a light-handed person or maybe it's a little hard for you to kind of make those big moves. Do a little bit of practice or you step outside your comfort zone, right? So we've covered a couple things not to do, right? So avoid heavy outlines, avoid flattening your object by not following the curves of your object. Another thing to do is to avoid kind of checking out. A lot of times when we're applying pen and line like this, it can be kind of a meditative sort of thing. If you put on some music and just kind of get into hatching, cross hatching, stippling, and scumbling, that can be a really great experience. So just make sure that, if you are going to do that, that you stay focused still, because a lot of students sometimes they'll either get bored, they'll get tired, they'll get distracted, and they'll kind of start through the buying a lot of types of. And that's where breaks come in hand, especially if you're like me. I like to grip my pencil really tightly, so that is sometimes not always comfortable. So it's a good idea to take breaks. It's a good idea to step back and look and do all that good stuff. Additionally, as I've been mentioning here, varying up the length of your lines can be really great. You'll notice for our value scale, we took everything pretty much to the lengths of the edge of our object. Over here, you can see I've added some shorter lines. So definitely experiment with, what happens if you do these longer sweeping lines. What happens when you kind of break them up a little bit? What happens when you have little dashes or little kind of collections of dash marks? That's a really great way to keep varying it up, changing it up, all that kind of stuff. So let's do my cast shadow here. So again, I've been using the same pen for this whole drawing. As I mentioned, it is possible. But if you're noticing that you're not able to get what you're looking for out of that pen, you should switch it up. And of course, pay attention to your speed, just like we talked about with our regular line drawing, our contour line drawings. You know, I'm moving relatively fast just for demonstration purposes. You know, if you're the type of person, if you're moving fast and your lines are looking a little sloppy, you should probably slow down and say, okay, well, can I get more control when I move slower? Usually that is the case, but I know some people are different in how they work. I'm still examining my value fundamentals, my core of shadow, where's the darkest portion. Since this is an imaginative object, I can kind of define my own rules, which is pretty cool. But, you know, when you're drawing an object that's in front of you, look and see what is happening in front of you. I need to erase little guidelines here. Good times. Great. And so then I can kind of start to come in and smooth this area out a little bit, right? Right. Oop, let me not move all my stuff. All right. So again, if you want a little bit more structured practice, if you're noticing that, you know, freestyle and it is not working for you, I recommend going back to the slides and checking out some of those work pages. Sometimes it can be good. I did post a couple of YouTube tutorials for different mark making strategies. So following along with those videos can also be a great exercise, a great way to help strengthen your practice. There's a lot of great books out there too. I usually suggest, you know, watching those YouTube videos and checking what's on the slides because those things are free. But of course, um, a lot of students that work in pen and ink really like Alfonso Dunn, whose video I linked page, drawing workbook. And it's kind of a series of exercises. It gives you some tips and tricks and stuff like that. So if you do like kind of that more regimented textbook kind of study situation, that's been a good one that students have enjoyed in the past that I've recommended. But otherwise, check out the free stuff first. You know, he has a lot of informative videos. I'm showing you some stuff. You can read about the stuff on the slides. You can look at examples. It's good to learn from multiple sources, especially with something as variable as ink drawing, because ink drawing takes a variety of forms, a variety of styles. That's what's so exciting, but also confounding sometimes to students about this stuff. And of course, my camera decided to reverse, so there she goes. Always a fun time. So, while you guys are working on your spheres, or if you're done working on your spheres, I like to do for good measure when I'm starting a new process or getting to know a new thing, it's good to do a little object study. I'm sure you guys, a lot of you guys enjoyed the object studies that we did for value. Remember the apple, the ear, the drape, bonus object? This can be a good thing to practice as well this week if you budget the time properly. So I'm gonna bring back my little skull friend, per usual, getting into the spirit, right? So I'm gonna do a little object study here in my sketchbook just to show you guys, you know, adapting what we learned here and what we learned here to something that's real, so that then when we go and set up an actual still life, when we set up actual objects for our assignment, then we'll be cooking, right? So before we move on to this, a couple other quick things. Like we said, don't be afraid to experiment with some of your wild card materials. Like we said, either a micron or the Pitt pens are a great baseline to start off with. And then you can think about incorporating maybe some other materials if you're feeling experimental. There's a lot of great stuff out there. You probably have all kinds of cool stuff at your home. If you want to incorporate colored chalks in the background, if you wanted to, you know, maybe use a little colored pencil to add a little pop of color, if you wanted to pop in some charcoal, that could be cool. Um, or, you know, like we said, if you wanted to play with pen, if you wanted to come in with the pen and say, oh, let's do some clouds back here, you know, you could play with, you know, different textures and combining different materials and things like that. Just kind of keep an eye if you are going to use different pens. Sometimes the inks are formulated differently. And sometimes the pigments will also be very different too. You can see with this ballpoint pen, the ink is kind of a bluish purple. I'm sure you guys have noticed that sometimes with Sharpies that are dyeing. Sometimes the black Sharpies look kind of purpley or blue. It's kind of the same with this particular ballpoint pen that I have here. So think about if that looks good with that, if it clashes too much. You know, you can definitely experiment, play. This is our little play space here. Right? It's always kind of fun to experiment a little bit. There's also different colors of pens, right? There's erasable pens too. I got these, I forgot where I got these. These are Pilot. What are these even called? Friction with an extra X. How exciting. But these pens, you can kind of erase. They're not entirely permanent or waterproof or archival. I've done drawings in these and they've faded because I've had the stuff hanging up next to a window that's very bright. But if you wanted to investigate pens that erase, that could be something cool to play with. There's also these kind of sketch marker type of things. If you really like the brush pens, either the Pitt or the Pigmas, sometimes these sketch markers can be really cool too, because usually with these, this is kind of an off brand, but I know Copic markers people really like. Here made these. You can experiment with these, you know, sketchy type of lines. What happens if I wanted to color in a background? Ooh, if I could smell this through my mask, that alcohol. So, you know, also keep in mind things that bleed, right? Like we said, sometimes these alcohol pens can bleed through the page. So if you're using your sketchbook, make sure you don't have anything important on the other side if you're playing around with these. Oof, that is smelly. Here we go. Oh, goodness. Anyway, so let's do our little object study just to kind of put it all together, put the pieces together for y'all. So that's very messy. We'll ignore that. There. It's almost off the page. So let's say we got our little skull friend here, right? So I'm going to try to tilt it at the same direction that I'm going to be drawing it at so you guys can see, you know, a little bit more. There we go. There it is. Boing. So if you're going to be doing an object study or setting up for your for real drawing, you know, make sure that you select objects that are interesting to you, that have, you know, interesting formal strategies. Start to think about, like we said, conceptual and content based information, because as the class goes onward, as you guys have more freedom, we're going to look at your choices a little bit more deeply, right? We'll say, okay, well, since you had the choice of nearly every object, why'd you pick that one? Why'd you do this? Why'd you do that? So it's kind of cool to think about that too. I picked this object because I think it's interesting formally. It's also on brand with time of the year. Um, we'll get into that a little more later. But basically, I'm starting off with this object, but when you're doing, you know, like we said, your still life drawing or stuff like that, like we said, there is no object minimum or maximum. This is up to you to think about what you can do to challenge yourself with the materials that we have, the materials that we're adding to this. There's a still life set up in the studio. If you wanted some objects and something a little more out of the ordinary, remember the same rules still apply. If you see it, you must draw it. This must be an observation based drawing. Even though we're using different materials, we're still going to keep our same principles. So, again, that means, you know, don't just kind of say, oh, there's the skull, and then draw it from memory or eyeball it. This should be, you know, things that you're still observing very directly and very closely, right? Again, if you're having trouble calibrating yourself in your eye, remember our blind contour drawings, remember things like gesture. Those can be great exercises to bring back to make sure that you're holding yourself accountable, because if your angles aren't correct, if your proportions aren't correct, all the beautiful pen marks in the world are not going to matter as much. We're still gonna observe those inconsistencies that you put on the page. Anyway, let's get into it. So from start to finish, an observational object with pen. So let's hit it. So first we're going to do our organizational line drawing after we've arranged our object at the angle that we would like with the light source that we would like. This is fine right now. We'll roll with it. But when you're at home, you should really take a deeper look. You know, is looking at that, right? if I ask you about it, or if, there's a question about it, you should be able to justify it. You should be able to explain it. It shouldn't just be, whoops, I threw it on the table. Here's my stuff. I guess I'll draw this. Everything should be very purposeful, right? Because with ink, it's a lot harder to go back, right? You have to set up your choices and then deal with them, right? So since this is just an object drawing, just the angle and the lighting is what I care about. But for your homework assignment, consider things like environment, right? What's the grounding like? What's going on in the background? What you doing? Is it deep space, shallow space, all that good stuff. So organizational line drawing, I'm probably going to want to use something I can erase, like graphite, a pencil. So we're going to start off with our simple shapes. So this skull can be divided into a circle for the main cranium area, and we can also do kind of a mini sort of blob for the jaw. So my angle that I'm looking at it is a little different than yours, but I'll adapt. So I can kind of see. All right. Very simple sketch to start off with, right? Don't go regressing. Don't go doing things that are not proper. So once you have your organizational line drawing, remember, like we said, if it takes you a long time to get your sketching done, do some gestures to warm up, right? Because we want to make sure that we're still using what we have learned in the class, right? And economy should be one of them. So we got our friend here. Now we need to refine these areas, start from general, work your way towards greater specificity, because we need to figure out how exactly we're going to start to cite, where do we begin, and you need to have things to start off with, right? So I'm still using the little graphite pencil, mechanical pencil, do what works for you. So I'm going to kind of eyeball and say, here's my jaw or my cheekbone. Got my little guys here. All right, just very light, very loose, very fast, just like we normally do. Again, citing should be getting easier for you as the semester goes on, depending on your objects, obviously. Some objects are going to give you a challenge no matter what. But if you're noticing that citing is still a struggle for you or something that you're still unwilling to do, set aside some time over the week to maybe review some of the older module content, set up a still life for yourself or some objects, and just practice getting the proper proportions. Maybe don't do value or don't add pen to these practice drawings, and make sure you're really getting those fundamentals down, because if you're skipping your citing, if you're skipping through that stuff, we're not doing that. So make sure that you have a strong foundation drawing, right? So I plotted out my area, so now I can start to cite. So remember, we're going to be using our pencil, or I'm going to be using my pencil. I want to cite the height versus the width of my object, since that's a great proportional check. So when it comes to my width, I position my lead and my fingernail. I say, okay, how many of those are in here? So we've got 1.5. So here we go 1, we do 1.5. So I drew that cranium a little too big that second time. So that's good, we can erase that. So again, check your width versus your height on your object first, and then see if those proportions match on your drawing next, right? So very hopefully that's not in any pencil. Back, if it's starting to get confusing, that's fine. Right. And then of course we need to start to plot our other areas too, right? So we can look at landmarks since we're focusing on this single object. If there was a still life and we had multiple objects, we could now use the skull to measure our other objects. But since there's none over there, we won't get into it. So let's take a look at what happens at the halfway point of our skull, right? Oops, you guys are looking a little different up here as opposed to my angle. So when we do halfway down the skull, you can see that's where our nose is. So if I take here and I take here and I do halfway and I make a plumb line, which are very important, I can say, okay, well, I know my nose needs to drop a little bit now, right? Always use what you have in front of you and check it with what you got here, right? You don't need to be an expert in whatever kind of skull this is to draw it well. You just have to be aware of what you see in front of you and use that proportional information. And like we said, this will help you, right? Especially, for those of you guys that want to work in illustration, you want to eventually abstract things, you got to know what's in front of you first before you start inventing things. So again, if you're just eyeballing stuff, if you're just guessing, don't do that. We have it in front of us. Let's draw it. So I can see I'm starting to work in some of those areas. Right, my little eyeballs. Getting those curves in, check the angles of things. What's the angle of that eye socket looking like? Stuff there. Again, don't draw too dark yet. I'm drawing a little dark for demonstration purposes so the camera can actually pick up what I'm doing. So now we want to check the angle of the jaw here. Good. Again, angles are going to be very important. You guys know all about space now, that we did perspective. So you want to make sure that advancing and receding space are considered and indicated accordingly on the page. Of course, this is where we see our little jawline. Where does it peak? Here. Right. So like we said, still do your pencil sketch, still bring out the graphites. Just because we're using pens doesn't mean you have to throw away all your pencils, right? We can still use them. Some people like to play with their charcoals in their pens and how those layer. That could be something fun we do later. But again, basic pencil sketch. Nothing new, nothing too spicy. So now what we're going to do, now that we have, pretty much our sighting figured out, we need to go in and start to work in those pens, right? So I'm going to use, let's see, we want to use kind of a medium type of pen, something a little lighter, but not too light, to do our preliminary inking, right? So let's go ahead and I'm going to stick with my 01 just to show you that's consistent. So what we want to do now is we want to ink the primary areas of our object, right? We definitely don't want to overly outline things. We don't want things to be too dark or too heavy, but we need to start laying some stuff down. So remember what we talked about with contour line, right? Lines can be thin, they can be thick, all kinds of stuff like that. So got that little guy. I'm gonna do, and take it slow. I can see that a lot of times, sometimes students will rush and they'll just outline things and go through the motions there, and those don't look as good. You want, okay, well, what's happening to this object, right? A little shaky, that can be cool. Other areas where you need to be precise, bring back your old friend the ruler, right? And I'm okay with this outer contour being a little bit robust, but you don't want it to be too heavy right away. So I'm being very careful because you can see that this area of the skull, there's not big dark outlines over everything, right? There's a lot of really subtle kind of texture things. So I definitely don't want to start making lines and all kinds of stuff like that. I probably want to add a line here. Working it very lightly because you can see, like we said, there is no super sharp contour line that divides the inside of the eye socket with my cheekbone. There is this little kind of weird line that's flying here, but in terms of right here, it's merely a difference of tones. So I'm just going to very lightly pop it in there. So here you can see we have a little bit more of a defined area, so that's cool. We can add a little contour. And add these the nostril shapes, the nasal cavity. All right, ink those in there. Again, just be careful. Don't overly outline everything because that's what students tend to do, and then their drawing tends to look a little flat. I can add these lines in here too, now that I'm thinking about them. All right. Just basically, we can always soften them up later. Just pressing lightly, maybe not even pressing at all, letting the pen move, glide across the page. Right. And again, my angle is a little bit different than your guys's, so if you're saying that doesn't look like that, my eyes are slightly at a different portion than the camera. So, okay. And of course, that's gonna allow us to dip into here, flowing into there, right? So definitely consider how you can pick out different objects that have different levels of clarity, right? If you're drawing soft objects, hard objects, that can present a lot of opportunities to play around and experiment, right? Pretty cool stuff. Too neat. And of course, if you're at an area like me where I need to start to think about these teeth, you can always pick back up your graphite and do a little bit of sketching if maybe you forgot certain areas, right? And again, if you see it, you must draw it. The rules still apply. We can take a break next time when we do collage. Again, I like to lay it in with the graphite first because it lets me practice. Now I can come back and say, okay, well, what's going on with this pen? Now I can come and say, okay, these are all kind of lined, so I can line them as well. And obviously those crevices between the teeth are a bit thicker, but I'm doing my first pass through with my inking, so I'm gonna let it roll. It's okay if I made a boo-boo there. But let's get these lower teeth in here. It's a bit of a different shape. So again, this isn't anything, too different than what we did with charcoal, right? You do your preliminary drawing, and then you can kind of come in with your materials and pop the details in, right? So now we're at a point where everything is pretty much lined accordingly, right? We have our main contours all figured out. So if you did want to bring in your eraser, I'm gonna move it real quick and kind of push back some of the stuff. The sketchiness is distracting to you. That can be good. But if you want to leave in maybe some of these reference lines and stuff like that, that could also be helpful. But for me, I'm just gonna push it all back. And at this point, you might say, oh no, my drawing, it looks so stark. That's okay. We're gonna add in that ink. Let's try to get it back to where I had it before. There we go. So now I can come through like I did with my sphere and figure out, okay, what's going on here? So just like with value, identifying, squinting at your object and identifying your patches of value is a great way to start, right? So I can see that darker concentration in here, here, here can be right good, right? That's what we're gonna do. So let's go in and start to do maybe some etching, right? So I'm gonna experiment with all the different types of line applications here. So if I wanted to do some hatching for that area of the jaw, I can just do some sweeping lines going down, kind of curving with my jaw, going in the same direction, right? That could be a way to apply a patch of value. You can also experiment, like we said, with kind of more defined lines. You can see here, I'm going to add, dashed lines in here, right? And then, of course, we also have things like cross hatching, where if you switch the direction and build up some more line on there, do that as well, right? Again, remember your friend cross contour, let your lines curve and kind of follow your object, and that'll look a bit more natural, right? We also have, as we discussed earlier, stippling and scumbling. Scumbling, like we said, is when you kind of scrub with your pen to get kind of these irregular, kind of scribbly areas. We also have stippling, right? Which is using a series of dots to create areas of tone, right? So you can see up here, these types of areas would be very helpful to do some stippling, right? Maybe in here, some scumbling would be quite helpful. So you can see here, because we don't have kind of a perfectly straight, smooth area, kind of adding a little bit of scumbling would be a great way to add texture, add that kind of bony texture, right? And of course, you could also layer, you could start off with some hatching, right? If you need a patch or texture, and then you can kind of scumble on top of it, right? It's all about layering, try different combinations, right? Again, always look back to your object and see what's going on with that texture, with the shape, and with the tone of it, right? And that will help guide you as to what types of lines, what types of things do you need to include, right? You can see that the application of the darker paint and the recesses of this little skull are a little bit kind of craggly and crumbly. So scumbling would be a good way to emulate that type of roughness, right? So let's go ahead and see here. So as an example for stippling, before we kind of get into here and start getting into my other values, up here, we can see it's kind of a speckled, kind of patchy area. So you can add a series of dots to kind of show that little crevice that we have in here. All right. You can see I'm just using a series of dots. The closer the dots are together, the darker that area appears. As I start to space them out more, you can see it kind of flows into the lighter values, right? And then of course we can use stippling to kind of take us through this cranial fissure up there that we got going on in the skull. Since that area is in pretty bright light, making a nice line. Patching or crossing. Some people like to do that if that's your aesthetic. For this one, I'm going to use lots of different types of line just to change it up, just to show you guys experimentation, because this is our object study. This is meant to be experimental and as practice, right? So if maybe you're working with an object that's a little more challenging, or maybe something you've never drawn before, maybe do a little object study, or maybe even something you have drawn before, but maybe you've never done pen. It's good to try things out. It's good to practice, right? But of course, I need to add my other patches because I kind of have a disparate type of situation here. So I'm going to lay in my main patch as a value, just like I do with my charcoal, because I know that helps me. Some people like to plot it out as well. You think back to, Venetian landscape artists, how they kind of plot it out. Okay, well, this area is going to be dark. This area is going to be light. That's kind of a cool thing to try. So I'm going to plot out all the areas where I know are going to be pretty dark. Gotta get some darkness in here. Gotta get some darkness in there. Gotta go over here. And here is going to be very dark. Okay. And then, of course, I've got these little areas here. I'll probably just do those by hand or individually, right? The idea that, okay, well, we've got these extra little kind of scumbly type of areas where the paint was kind of junky. Make different decisions based on what you see here. So let's deepen these lines here. See, I'm kind of skipping around. Some people like to be a little more methodical about it. With drawings like these with pen, because it does tend to take a little bit longer, especially if you're newer to the process. It's good to compartmentalize, but of course, take a step back every now and then and say, okay, well, what's going on? What's going on? Yes, those are some good decisions to kind of keep an eye on as you're rolling along, right? But like we said, these drawings might not look amazing right away, but you need to stay the course, right? And practice, like we said. And of course, if you're not sure, always look back to your object. With these pen drawings, it's definitely tempting to kind of just spend all your time looking at your drawing as opposed to your actual objects. So make sure you don't fall back into old habits. To get to know what you have to do on the page, you got to look at your object, right? So make sure you do that. And of course, my little lighting is different over here. So you can see I'm barely grazing the surface with my pen. Just letting it kind of skip over. Whoop, we rotated. Oh, thanks, camera. There we go. We back at it. So, like we said, squint at your object, figure out where those darkest points are, the lightest points, everything in between. I need to do this deeper area in here. Since I plotted out, I know these areas are going to be dark. Let's go ahead and hit it. Again, build up to your dark values, right? Layering, like we said, very key. You can see I'm going a little faster because I know this area has to be filled in. Some areas you should draw slower, some you should draw faster, right? I know this to be true. All right, what's going on over here? Let's do some of these lines. If you're noticing things are too thick, switch pens, right? Because again, you can do really light lines, it's still going to be the same thickness. Let's bring out the 005. Let's get wild with it. So this one is dying. Let's get out of here. There we go. That one's crisper. Let's go. So again, even thinner lines you can play with, right? To get to know your pens, start to figure out, what's your favorite, what gives you your most optimal results. Because some people are different. Some people prefer the thicker pens. Some people like to get into the detail with the little ones. There's no right or wrong answer. It just kind of depends on what you're drawing, right? Back up the macro. What you see it, you must draw it. There's no other rules there. Like I said, budgeting your time is very important, especially for these pen drawings. You do have a choice for how many objects you can draw for the homework number 9. So if you notice, okay, well, maybe I want to hyper focus on maybe a single object or maybe a complex and a simple object to ground it. That could be a good kind of happy medium, in terms of challenging yourself, but also being realistic, because that's another thing to consider is economy, right? So, okay, I'm letting this flow out of here. So before I kind of did that line and it was a little bit too sharp, so now I'm adding a little bit of rustic quality to it. So again, pay attention to the edge quality of things. Are they sharp? Are they not so sharp? And paying attention to what I see. A lot of people, again, don't just color in these all black because that's not how they look. There are values within your values. You have to do that even with your pens. So I'm adding some layering, got some hatching, some cross hatching, maybe a little bit of scumbling on top of this. You know, Ever use these techniques? Try them out, right? And that's why we're spending time practicing. And mind your pressure. And before I move on and continue with my old friend detail here, keep in mind your contours. When I did that initial pass through with the pen, you can always darken some areas of your contours, right? Like for example, if I want to ground this thing a little bit further, obviously I'll add my cast shadow and all of that. You can come back with your pen and say, all right, well, maybe this area of my contour should be a little bit darker, right? A little bit of something, something there. Where things change direction or where things overlap, you could pop in a little bit of a darker contour there, right? Definitely remember what you've learned so far. Don't throw it away. Because like we said, contour and line are going to be very important to help bolster what's going on with your pens in terms of the interior features, right? So now you see that's a very deep area there. So we'll make darker contour, right? There. Do anything that, and of course, if you're noticing that, maybe there are some areas that are a little bit too pale or that aren't activated, look at your object, right? You can see here we've got some pitting. I could also add some little dashes, which could be cool. So don't be afraid to kind of experiment, right? See, I'm adding really tiny lines here, kind of short lines to activate this portion of my skull, right? Because you definitely don't want it to get um, too light. Yeah. Okay. Give me a second. All right, guys. So give me 2 seconds. So, like we said, texture, exploration, all that fun stuff. And if you get stuck, I highly recommend taking a step back, like I did, to assist another student, but also to it's good to get that hindsight, right? Well, time certainly flies. Here we go. Just as a recap, on Thursday, we're going to be covering ink wash. So, like we said, these are pens. It's going to tie into homework number 9, which is going to involve you making a pen drawing of your own from observation. So, like we said, freedom in terms of the amount of objects, the type of objects. So, if maybe you're interested in something in a formal or conceptual way, it's a great time to explore that, right? Because, like we said, pens can do a lot in terms of, showing off different features of an object, right? There we go. So me personally, I really like the 0.005 microns because if you do really light pressure, you can get some pretty delicate tones and features. But I know not everybody is interested in that aesthetic, or your object might not call for it. So definitely use the pen that works best for you. I recommend starting, somewhere in the middle, kind of your medium width pens, and then adjusting one way or the other. Definitely, some students like to start off coming in hot with the brush pens. But of course, like we said, these can be really great for, extra lines in the background. Like if I wanted to draw a horizon, you know, doing different of them, it gives nice kind of fluffy faded lines, and that can be cool. Since this object here is pretty solid, that can definitely be a thing. Some people like to use the brush pens for drapery. Like if you have a crease, you can kind of do a little fade like that, right? Or you could do little kind of wiggly lines. That could be fun. So, definitely let the object tell you indirectly um, what it needs, because that'll give you a good clue. Because, like we said, another big challenge of the pen drawings is the idea of permanence, and of course, the idea that there's a lot of choice, right? You can manipulate these to get all kinds of styles, all kinds of marks. So, knowing what to do can sometimes take a bit of practice, a little bit of decision making. And of course, we're evaluating you guys on those decisions, and mistakes are okay, and you'll get better with each time. Just remember your fundamentals and start with those, which is what I'm doing here with this eye socket. My goodness. So we've got a big shadow here. And of course, there's a little bit of shadow back here. Oop. Kind of scrubbing really lightly. Just the tiniest tip of that nib to get those lighter areas back there. That's what I like to see that stuff. This area is pretty bright, so I'm not going to fuss with it too much, but I can add a little bit more of this. A very light effect. Again, we'd like a full spectrum of value. Another kind of big kind of risk of these drawings is the idea of them looking a little bit too stark, or the contrast being a bit too much. So look at your areas of negative and positive space. Say, okay, is that light? Is that highlight? What is happening? How can I enhance these features and get this guy going? Alright, now it's like, where are those highlights? Where can I make those areas pop? Oop, need some darkness down here. Do, do, do. Right. Now that I'm rounding the bases for my actual object, I need to adjust its grounding because right now it's kind of floating around down here in the abyss. So let's kind of problem solve a little bit. I'm going to make the ground black, and I'm going to do kind of a scumbled background to kind of help smooth out some of this chaos that's going on here. So I'm going to go ahead and pick a brush pen, and I'm going to use that to help fill in some of these larger areas of ground, right? So keep in mind that when we do ink wash, it'll allow us to fill in these areas quite a bit more. But of course, in the meantime, we can use these pens to fill in larger areas. And you can see my strokes when they overlap. You can sometimes see them depending on the type of paper that you're using. So it's important to kind of mind your layering and get the type of texture you like. I'm okay with this kind of streaky texture, but if you're not, you should definitely adjust it and maybe use a different type of pen or a couple different layers, right? I'm not going for your pure black right now. I'm just going for just to fill it in. A nice kind of general sort of gray. If you wanted to use your charcoals to pop in a background or chalks, that could be a cool thing too, right? So I'm kind of at the position where I don't really see my cast shadow as much. So oops, I got the squeaky marker. That's okay. So again, I want to be nice and careful because like we said, these brush pens are prone to kind of break down and bend a little bit. So you want to watch your nibs. Keep an eye on those. And think about back, especially for your finished pieces, right? Like we said, you know, backgrounds can be fun to do with charcoals. You can also play with the pens and that kind of stuff. Let's see what kind of pen I'd like to switch to. Oh, goodness gracious. Let's see. Let's do this one. If you wanted to do kind of a scumbled background to kind of play around a little bit, that's great. Especially because, you know, I kind of have sort of a generalized background, but, you know, pay attention to how you guys are setting up at home, how you guys are setting up your still lives and stuff like that. You know, if there's a backdrop of, you know, maybe something that's darker than the ground, you can indicate that. If you have maybe fabric or wood or something back there, that can be a cool thing to try to indicate with your old friend the pen, right? So if I wanted to do kind of this texture in the background, that might be a cool way to draw attention back to my actual object, which is definitely something that we'd like, right? If I wanted to use maybe, wanted to bring back my brush pen and do that, I wanted a thicker line, that's something I could do, right? Think about what's going to complement what you got going on here, right? Because again, your objects should be the main focus. The environment should frame your object. Is usually how most people kind of approach composition. But of course, if maybe you're drawing a scene as opposed to kind of an object or objects, you're going to want to be a little more cognizant of what your background is doing, right? Because it's more important in terms of the content of your piece, right? So, like we said, if you wanted to maybe, you know, if you wanted to challenge yourself and get wild with it, You could do kind of a landscape, or you could do, a corner of your house or some sort of perspective or architecture, and see how that goes with pen, how you can adapt those subject matters. That could be pretty cool. Right. For me, I'm just adding a basic little guy. Right. And I'm darkening that contour just a little bit, just to add a little bit more pop, because I want to reinforce that the skull is closer to us than this background. Pretty logical, but sometimes we need to show it off. So doing some scumbling, having some fun with it. I didn't do as much down here as I would have hoped, so gotta put it somewhere. Or you don't really have to put it down there, but I like it as a technique. It's kind of fun to do. Pretty improvisational, we say. Right. So that will do it for this little guy.